Good morning. It is Sunday, April 11th, and we're at F-150 Studios in beautiful Starbucks, California. Wanted to talk today about Lyin, Biden, and the Second Amendment, and also the First Amendment. So, Joe unveiled his gun control proposals, as they're euphemistically called, infringements on the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, designed to reduce us under absolute despotism, if I may borrow a line from the Declaration of Independence. And during his presentation, Joe made several provably false statements. So let's start with, it all comes down to his argument that no amendment is absolute. So if that's the case, he has just put slavery, uh, extraction of confessions by torture, and Jim Crow back on the table. And so we started with the usual cliche, you're not allowed to shout fire in a crowded theater. Well, yes, you are. That's what pulling the fire alarm when you notice the theater is on fire is doing. That's what telling people where the fire is and where they don't want to go is doing. You're shouting fire in a crowded theater. So, yes, you can shout fire in a crowded theater. Uh, but then he goes on, from the very beginning of the Second Amendment, there were certain, you weren't allowed to own just any weapon. That's sort of true. The possession of crew-served weapons, which is to say artillery, uh, was generally not considered to be under the protection of the Second Amendment. The possession of the weapons of the individual soldier, which today means not just the civilian AR-15, but the military M16, the automatic fire version, absolutely is. The U.S. Supreme Court in 1939, in a government's appeal of a lower court declaring the National Firearms Act of 1934 unconstitutional under the Second Amendment, the U.S. Supreme Court came to an inaccurate conclusion based upon a flawed, not to say dishonest, argument. So Mr. Miller had been arrested and charged under National Firearms Act 1934 for possession of a short-barreled shotgun. The lower court found this to be violative of the Second Amendment, and Miller was acquitted and went on his way. The government challenged the case and went to the Supreme Court, and the case came before the court in 1939. Well, by 1939, Miller was dead. He was kind of a shady character, but he disappeared, and subsequently it was determined he'd been murdered. So there was no one representing Miller. So the Supreme Court hearing was just an ex parte hearing for the government, which argued dishonestly that short-barreled shotguns served no malicious purpose. And since none of the justices on the court had military experience, they didn't know, and they could not take judicial notice of the fact that short-barreled shotguns were in fact used in military actions. So for those of you who are not aware, if a judge has knowledge of a particular fact that is brought to him, the judge can take judicial notice of that fact in making a ruling on the case. There was a case years ago when then Attorney General Bill Lockyer trumped up charges against several gun dealers at the Pomona Gun Show. All of those charges were thrown out at the preliminary hearing because lack of corpus. The guys were not committing any crime, so that's more than a little bit of a technicality. But in one of those cases, the judge was a former military armorer, and he took judicial notice of the fact that what the defendant was charged with was not what he had. So, so that's judicial notice. No one on the court actually knew, either through experience or other knowledge, about the use of short-barreled shotguns in military action, and they swallowed hook, line, and sinker the government's argument that they weren't used in malicious purpose. So that's U.S. v. Miller in a nutshell, 1939 decision. There are several other cases, U.S. v. Miller, but I'm referring to the 1939 Second Amendment case. So moving on to Joe's next statement is that from the very beginning, certain people weren't allowed to own weapons. Yes, Joe, we call those black people. Some states enacted laws that prohibited the possession of arms by slaves and sometimes even by freed blacks, especially Virginia after Nate Turner's slave revolt. They forbade the possession of weapons by any black, slave or free. So Joe Biden is actually invoking slavery and historical racism as a justification for infringing the Second Amendment today. Well, back then you could say blacks couldn't own guns, so today you can say certain people can't own guns. Oh, Joe, 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 Joe. Um, and the authors of the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing equal protection, the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th banning slavery, 14th equal protection, 15th citizenship for anybody who was born in the U.S. The authors of the 14th Amendment, if you read the discussions, were explicitly concerned about preserving the right to keep and bear arms for the newly manumitted slaves and other blacks. So yes, Biden is saying that, well, 13th Amendment's not absolute. We can have slavery. 14th Amendment's absolute. We can have legal discrimination. Uh, Joe. Yeah, and that is an interesting discussion. Now, another aspect of Mr. Biden's discussion was in declaring Georgia's new voting law, Jim Crow on steroids. Well, according to you, Jim Crow's okay because the 14th Amendment's not absolute. What? Um, but of course, Georgia's voting law actually expands voting rights. Yes, it says electioneering is not allowed. People can't come offering gifts and favors, food and water to people standing in line if those people are political operatives. Um, I'm not quite sure why black people supposedly require copious amounts of food and water while they're waiting to vote. I've never really waited that long in line to vote. But also, apparently, we can't get IDs, even in a state that gives away an ID for free. You only have to pay if you want the driving privilege, but you can get a voter ID in Georgia for free. But Georgia's voting law is more expansive than the voting law in Biden's home state of Delaware. Uh, Major League Baseball moved the All-Star game to Colorado, which has the same voting law as Georgia. New York has shorter time frames for voting, the home of leftist darling Andrew Cuomo. So apparently some racism's okay, I suppose. But this is really, some severe distortions of the Constitution, what it means to be a citizen, and we really need to stand up in opposition to that. There are many encouraging signs the citizens are just done. Of course, there are always those, the sheeple, who will, bah, 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 sorry, losing my grip on the camera there. There are always those who will, you know, are happy to fasten the yokes about their own necks and ultimately be sheared and slaughtered and convinced that it's really the best thing. But ignoring those, there are people now who do seem determined to be free and and are going to push that issue. And I am happy to see that and pleased to be one of them and encourage the trend. So everyone take care. This has gone on a little bit long, but Biden had a lot to say that was just flat wrong. So I'll talk to you later. Uh, Still was going to offer some thoughts on the Derek Chauvin case, and I'll do that in a later video. Have a good day, everyone. Talk to you later.